A few words when adjusting the gap with your filler gauge. What is very important when you adjust one of the gaps, so the rocker arm has to be at the top position, and the only way to know when it's exactly at the very top position, when the gap is the largest here, is when the other valve or rocker arm, it's at the absolutely bottom position, lowest position. And you will, when you pull the cord, it's a good idea to just wrap the cord near the body of the engine, wrap it with your arm and just pull very small amounts. And you will notice the valve will just lower by very small amounts. So if it's not fully at the bottom, you will wrongly adjust the gap in this one, the lifted one. And one way is to just put your finger on the lowering valve or lowering arm and just do few tries and feel where it's really at the lowest position. It will just go very slowly at the bottom and then very slowly come back, and you really need to reach exactly that bottom point. If it's not the bottom one, the value here will be wrong, even if this one it's no longer moving at all. It's just that the gap will change with the movement, slight movements of the other one. Now for filling the gap, what I like to do is first just make sure you get the right gauge. Obviously the numbers are going to be different for your engine, and what some videos don't really show properly, some videos tell you to just move the filler gauge like this. This is wrong. What you want to do is this end portion that got into the gap has to be level with this surface here. If you pull it like this, it will make an angle and the feeling is not the right one. It will have too much friction. So what you want to do, you need to find an angle. Oftentimes you are going to go this way for this one and this way for that one. Sometimes there are things in the way, so maybe find a spot. What you want to do, just keep the filler gauge with two fingers like this, and with your middle, is that middle? with this finger, just press down on the gauge right here. And you want to really just get the feeling when this end of the gauge, it's really horizontal with the piece here. So it's all a matter of pressing, not too little and not too much. If you press too much, you are going to make too much friction. If you press too little, it's not going to be flat. So it's really just making it parallel with the gap, and that's absolutely important. Now, what about that friction feeling? Well, my way to describe this is you can either feel nothing, the gap is too wide. You can feel a slight friction, I think that's the right spot, or you can feel drag. And I make a distinction between slight friction and drag. Drag, it's too much, but one important point is to remember that it's always better to have the gap slightly too large than too tight. If you have the gap too tight under the spec, what will happen, especially for this house valve, by the way, is housed is the one opposite to the carburetor. So you may have the carburetor on this side, on the other side, it doesn't matter. The valve near the carburetor is the intake one. This is the coolest one. And this one opposite to the carburetor is housed one, gets all the hot gases to exit. So this one is the one that needs actually to stay more in contact with the head to cool down better, and the valve stays in contact with the head and cools down when the gap is slightly larger. If it's too tight, the valve will not have time to cool down and may overheat and just chip, and you lose pressure in the engine. So the idea is, if you are not sure, maybe let the gap slightly larger than the specs, slightly, not too much. So that means you want here not to have a feeling of drag, you want it to have a feeling of slight friction. So it's again, this is subjective to say slight friction, but if you have doubts, let's say you want, depends on the engine. Obviously this is strictly for this engine, your numbers are going to be different. You need to look for the PDF or just ask on forums. So let's just imagine this is millimeters, 0.15 millimeters. you need to have a 0.15 gap. To make it, just to be sure, slightly larger, just find another gauge. So maybe you, depends on your set, you see this one is 0.04. If I put these two together, and it's possible to just put them together, it's going to give you 0.19. This is just slightly thicker, more gap than what you need. So if you manage to pass these two in there, even if it's more friction, but if you manage to insert them, it means you have slightly more than 15, so you are going to be fine because your gap is just slightly more than the specs and you will not burn that valve. Okay, so this is just my tip. Maybe a suggestion for tightening these bolts here, these nuts actually. So you have securing nut and you have this tip. This is not the stem of the valve. The stem of the valve is below this. This is like a stud, if you want, that holds the movement of the stem of the valve. So it's the adjusting stem here. So when you want to loosen them up, loosen these bolts up, make sure the valve is at the bottom so it doesn't move, it's stuck. Only then loosen it up and tighten it back down. If it's moving like this, don't try to loosen it because it can be too tight and you may bend something in there or just damage something in there. So loosen and tighten back these bolts, these nuts, when the valve is almost all the way down, it doesn't move. Now my suggestion is when you loosen these nuts here, you will notice then you have you can rotate this small tip here, or whatever you call it, stud. Always, if you need to loosen it a little bit, it goes counterclockwise. Always move very small amounts, really the tiniest rotation. And when this by the way, when you loosen the nut to adjust the gap, you need to rotate the engine to bring the rocker arm at the top position after you loosen the nut. And it's a good idea to just kind of insert the filler gauge and then try to adjust the tip here, this pin, this stud, of what you call it. Try to adjust it with the filler gauge inserted and just rotate it gently until it stops, but really very slight force on it, just enough so it rotates. But don't forget your filler gauge in there when you turn the engine, because then you are going to have a problem. Just try to turn it over. So don't forget to remove the filler gauge when you want to move the rocker arm up and down, rotate the engine. Okay. Now question is how much tight are these nuts, locking nuts? My suggestion, because there are no numbers online, depends on the model. Some nuts are 8 millimeters, some are 10. My suggestion is get your wrench and just again put the rocker arm down. Just keep your finger on the head of the wrench, and that's how you tighten it. Put the torque that you can put on the head, really on the head. So just rotate it until you feel, actually you will rotate and you feel it stops at some point. Do not put all your strength in your fist. It's just a rotation, like I would call it normal force, and at some point it will just feel it stops and then you stop. That's it, my torque that I put on these things. It should be plenty enough so they don't loosen up while in operation. And when you tighten them down, there are instructions that say to counter hold the tip here, the stud. Well, it's not always possible, and usually if it's a quality engine, you will be able to tighten these nuts without touching the stud, and the stud will not rotate normally. But you should always, after securing the nuts, you should always spin the engine, pull the cord a few times and check again the gap after you tighten securely, and after you secure the nuts, the locking nuts. The cover here doesn't hold any oil. This is the cover, has 4 nuts normally. It doesn't hold any oil, but there is oil splashing, so make sure you don't damage the seal here, but don't over tighten the bolts of the cover. Don't stress too much about that part. Also be sure to remove the spark plug. So when you turn the cord of the engine, sometimes some engines may start, so you don't want the engine to start. Just undo the spark plug and just put it back in place just a safety matter. And make sure you don't drop anything in there, so careful what you have around here. Don't drop bolts, nuts going in there, because you will need perhaps something with a magnet to retrieve them. It's a good idea to clean the handle with some alcohol when you finish, because when you work with the gauges, you have oil, used engine oil on your hands. That's not healthy at all. So you don't want to spread it on the handle. So just maybe give it a wipe with alcohol all around.